Greetings. Welcome to SwineTime with Pipestone. I'm your host, Dr. Spencer Wayne. I'm here with my guest today, Dr. Scott D. We're going to talk to him about his transboundary work and the importance of securing our border for African swine fever. So today I have with me Dr. Scott D. Scott D is our Director of Research here at Pipestone, and he was recently at a meeting in China where he presented some information and continued our course of learning more about it within our group. And I think he's got some valuable things to share with us today. So Scott, welcome. Thank you for being here. And please tell us more.
Sure, I appreciate it. This is a great time. Good idea to do this. Yeah, you mentioned a meeting. Dr. Spronk and I we were invited to China to talk to a meeting, which is, we do that all the time, but this was a really interesting meeting. First of all, producers ran it, basically. They organized it, they ran it. It wasn't a government mandated session. Interesting also, 1,100 producers were in-house and another 100,000 were online. So we talked to a lot of people about the feed risk of African swine fever. So it was a really cool meeting.
Okay, so some basic things that kind of jump out when we think about African swine fever is, what have we learned and what are we doing? But starting with what have we learned, can you recap some things that we know about African swine fever and the risk it presents? Some research that you've done would be what I would key in on, and extending into other people's work as well. But starting with what you've done, can you just take us through a few basic things?
Sure. So this is probably the world's worst pig virus. It's close to 100% mortality once it gets rolling in a herd. It's very stable. It lives outside the pig for months and months and months. It lives in meat for years if it's frozen. So this is a much more difficult virus to deal with than anything we've ever have to fight before. And now it's in the world's biggest pig herd, right? It's in China, which is a whole game changer right there. So one of the things we worried about was, as we import 2 million metric tons a year in agricultural products from China, is there a risk that, say, feed ingredients could potentially be vehicles and move African swine fever from other countries into the United States? And we did a project where we published that, and we showed, African swine fever survives very well in certain feed ingredients, as we simulated a journey across continents, across the ocean, using transport times that were representative, using temperature and relative humidities of land and sea that were representative. And it was very stable. It lived in soy products, it lived in pet foods, it lived in choline chloride, it lived in complete feed, it lived in pork sausage casings. It's a very, very stable virus. And that was the first attempt to show whether this virus could survive in feed through what we'll call a transboundary model. So it wasn't me on a boat doing this in real life. This was set up in a very safe laboratory down at Kansas State University working with Dr. Megan Niederwer. So the industry was not at risk during any of this.
Yeah. Two things that have surprised a lot of people as this story has unfolded over the last few years, really starting with PED time, when we began to look at it, was we do in fact import soybean meal from China. Some quantity of I think it's organic soybean meal is the description, but some soybean meal comes from China. And you found that to be a very stable transport media for holding this virus alive. That and sausage casings come from here, go to China, are washed, and then return here. Is that I think surprised everybody.
Isn't that crazy?
I don't know if you want to comment further on exactly what comes over from China that might be at risk, but those two things jump out to me.
Oh, me too. I was amazed when we learned that soy oil cake, which is kind of one of the leftover products of soybean oil processing, soybeans, soybean meal, be it organic, inorganic, however you want to classify it, we bring a lot of that in from China, which is crazy since we make the best soy in the world. Why are we doing this? I think a lot of it goes into niche markets, a lot of it goes into the human food chain, a lot of it goes into organic pig production. So there's a concern because, as you said, of all the viruses we've tested, the vast majority of them lived really well in soy. There's something about soy that's highly protective. We don't know what it is, but high protein, low fat soy products really seem to support viral survivability for whatever reason. And it even supports it to the fact, well, it's not just alive. We didn't, we actually measured how much we started with and how much was still alive at the end of this simulation. We hardly lost any virus. So it not only kept it alive, but the decay curve was really, really slow. So these soy products are something we've got to keep our eye on as we move forward in talking about prevention later on in this discussion.
Right. So you've done quite a bit of work on how the stuff can be maintained in specific materials and the risk that those ingredients, those materials maybe represent to us as we look at imports. But then there's another researcher that you've worked with recently that's done some work on how does a pig actually become infected when it eats contaminated feed, contaminated at different levels, which is kind of the next step. Can you comment a little bit about Dr. Megan Niederwerder's work on that?
Yes, Dr. Megan Niederwerder is a wonderful scientist at Kansas State University. She helped us with our transport work with African swine fever that I just referenced. Her question was, well, if the pig eats contaminated feed, will it get infected? Or if it drinks contaminated water, will it get infected? And how much virus will it take to get that done? And so she showed very clearly that both sources, water and feed, can infect pigs if the dose is sufficient. The dose is very low in water, the dose is a little higher in feed, but it can happen. And she also showed that dose really wasn't that key. It was the frequency of exposure. So if the pig is, as we all know how pigs eat, they're up there nibbling all the time at their feed all day long. If this turned into a single exposure, a 10-time exposure, 20-time exposure, 30-time exposure, pigs could get infected with a very, very low dose, even when they only consume maybe about 4 or 5 pounds of feed. So it's highly infectious and highly contagious through feed, and even more so in water. It's even more infectious in water. So she answered a big question that segued nicely from our work on transport and survival across the ocean into, if the pigs eat the feed, will they get infected? And the answer is clearly yes. So my hat's off to Megan. She did a great job.
Excellent work. Kind of related to all that, it came to light recently that in China they've done quite a bit of sampling just to look at where is contamination within China. And this isn't our group. This is I think the Chinese government is sponsoring this just to understand it more. And can you just make a comment or two about where they're finding it over there in their general environment of people, towns, cities, food stores, pork farms, whatever? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, this is like the missing link. Because you ask, how could this whole process of survival over the ocean and transmission to pigs get started? And I have to credit that this is producers are actually driving this in China. This isn't a government issue. Producers are actually going out and they're sampling grains that are drying on the ground. So as you know, as they harvest, they put the grains on the road, they let the sun and everything dry those out, and then they ship it over to us. So they looked at soy, they looked at wheat, rice, corn, DDGs. Those were positive with African swine fever. They looked at complete feed, it was positive. They went to the mill, it was positive. The trucks and trailers hauling the feed were positive. And the people, their hair, the bottoms of their shoes were positive. So this viral load, think of it as like a nuclear cloud of virus over the city or the country of China. It's like a bomb went off and there's virus everywhere. Think of a mushroom cloud. And so the environmental load is getting contaminated at a higher level. And so that's going to end up with more cross-contamination. And I think that's how these grains are getting contaminated, because they're literally laying on the ground as trucks and people and everybody else is passing by. So that's kind of the last bit of the puzzle. Interestingly enough, we learned that the level of infection in these products is extremely low. For example, you have to sample 10,000 feed samples to find 1 to 2% positive. So it's like a needle in a haystack. If you're picturing a mushroom cloud, think of also a needle in a haystack, because that's where the virus is hiding out. And that's how it should be. I think as a virus person, to me, that makes sense. You'd have these little pockets, a little nidus of infection in this big tonnage. Very difficult to detect unless you actually go to do the work and spend the money to collect 10,000 samples of feed dust. So great work, and they showed us that at this meeting. So it was a fascinating observation that I learned from the Chinese.
Yeah, no, excellent. So we've learned a lot. Everything you just wrapped up there on the level of potential contamination at the source, how that contamination could get here, and then how much it might take to actually infect a pig if eating infected material. It's a great story for understanding. But then what do we do about it is the next thing. You've also been involved in just decision-making processes that we as a nation are going to be looking at in front of us now. And then there's been a recent situation with some smuggled pork coming in and things across borders. All these things kind of tie together at the border, really, for what comes into this country. Can you comment on political activity, just the risk in general, and how we look at it and what we're doing about it as a country.
Sure. I'm very proud of our swine industry. The swine industry is leading, and they are organizing what we call storage times, first of all, for imports to come in from China. And these products will get stored in almost like a quarantine for breeding stock for a 30 to 45 day period to allow time to keep the virus from dying, allow it to decay over time. Time is our friend. These viruses don't live in this material forever. Eventually they decay. So storage time. Mitigation, we're looking at different feed additives we could use to neutralize the virus or reduce viral load. That's an important piece of research we're working on hard at Pipestone now in 2019. And then you mentioned legislation and policy change. Just last week at Pork Forum, National Pork Forum, 3 very important resolutions were passed that the pork producers brought forward for discussion and debate at the national, and they all passed unanimously on the topic of preventing foreign animal diseases into the country. From a high level, one of the resolutions looked at restricting imports of soy-based products from high-risk countries, which I think is paramount of importance because we know, like we talked earlier today, how these viruses live in soy. We got to look at, we make the best soy in the world. We got to quit bringing it in. So that's resolution 1. Resolution 2 was we got to work together with the Canadians. We got to work together with the Mexicans. We got to have a continental collaboration, all working together to keep this thing out. It doesn't matter. If one of us does it by ourselves and the other one gets infected, all of a sudden we're all in the same boat, right? So we got to be working together. And then the final was, let's look at how to responsibly import products. How do we safely bring products in? Understanding where they come from, understanding what the half-life of the virus is. Can we store it? Can we mitigate it? Can we communicate each other from the source to the recipient what's going on? So that's a very different way of thinking. It's almost like changing behavior.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff, Scott. So we've learned a lot, and then you just wrapped up on changing the world, essentially changing our country, changing what we do, which is the whole key of learning. If we don't do something different, so we're doing something different. It sounds like great. I really appreciate you being here, sharing that with us. I hope everybody listening enjoyed that as well and got something out of it. Pipestone's very pleased to present SwineTime, this podcast created for the pork industry and individual pork producers around the country. So make sure to bookmark this page to make sure you're fully informed regarding pork industry news, advancements in animal care, and how to enhance your productivity. Thank you, and see you next time.